Aedín, UNICEF are one of the, I think, most recognised organisations that work globally in the world today. In case any of our listeners are not aware of the range of work that you do, could you give me a reminder or summary of who UNICEF are, a bit about your history, and finally, could you tell me about the work that you do today, both in Ireland and other countries, please?
Absolutely, Darren, I'd be happy to. UNICEF has a genuinely fascinating history. So it's part of the United Nations, and it's the United Nations Organisation for Children. So our role in the United Nations family is to look after the rights of children. And that covers all kinds of areas, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. But in terms of the history of the organisation, we were established after the Second World War, and we've just therefore celebrated 70 years in operation. So by any standards, that's a very long living organisation now at this stage, and we've a very rich history that we're really, really proud of. So in that initial stage after World War II, we looked after the needs of refugee children, and believe it or not, Audrey Hepburn was one of those. Audrey Hepburn was a really famous Hollywood actress who went on to become a UNICEF ambassador. But as a child, she actually benefited from UNICEF. So UNICEF would have been bringing in supplies. I believe she was from Belgium. So they would have been bringing in supplies to help children who found themselves in impoverished circumstances after the war. And the central tenet of our organisation when it was set up was that we would only be set up if our first executive director, Maurice Pat, said if we were servicing children from all countries and all cultures. So there was no discrimination made on the basis of where the child came from. So if you imagine Europe post-World War II, clearly there were some nations that were, being made to pay for what had happened during the war. But UNICEF's raison d'etre was to look after all children everywhere. And that continues today. Our slogan is for every child. So it doesn't matter where the child is from. It doesn't matter what rights they currently have access to or what the circumstances of their country is. We fight for all children equally. So, we're here in Ireland, we work for Irish children, and we also work for children in 190 other countries. So we're really one of the only organisations that has that kind of reach right across the globe, and it gives us enormous strength and power.
Yeah, I didn't know you're actually part of the United Nations. That's a big fact I didn't know. Can you tell me and give me some examples as to how your work in Ireland fits into the work that you do internationally? Because I know you do a lot of work internationally, like in countries that are a lot poorer than Ireland.
So again, if we go back to what UNICEF is for, UNICEF is to promote the rights of the child. So that means for Irish children as much as for children elsewhere in the world. So it takes different forms in different countries. Children in Ireland, for example, obviously have many of their rights realised, but there also are many areas in which we are not providing for children in Ireland, and we need to do more. And it is UNICEF's job to make sure that there is a voice for that cohort. Young people traditionally are not allowed to vote, and they don't have that kind of access to government. Now, we are fortunate in Ireland because really we have an excellent leadership and an excellent government who do their best to realise children's rights. But there are still many areas where there is progress that's needed. And it's our job to stand up and say, this is the area now that we need focus on, and this is where we're falling down. So, for example, in Ireland at the moment, clearly there are thousands of children who are in inadequate housing situations. When I say inadequate, I mean not adequate. So, homelessness is a massive issue, and we need to make sure that we are providing more housing and services for children.
Tell me, looking at the big picture, as to what the biggest problems for children are in the world today, and how you are addressing these.
Sure. Well, there are many problems for children all over the world. Child protection is a big concern, and UNICEF works to end violence against children. So unfortunately, that is still a real and present danger in the lives of many children. We also work to make sure that children have access to education. This is a particular area of focus for UNICEF. We believe really strongly that children will only be able to succeed in their own lives if they are given the opportunity to have access to education. And while that might seem incredibly obvious, sometimes situations become very complicated. For example, in the aftermath of an emergency or a crisis, such as an earthquake, we all know that we prioritise needs like medical, shelter and water, but that is also the point at which we need to be ensuring that children are kept in education. So you can imagine in a situation where a town has been flattened, for example, and the family is just trying to find somewhere safe to stay. What we're saying is that education needs to be at the top of that priority list as well. And the reason is that we know there's plenty of evidence to suggest that if children fall out of education at all, it's very difficult for them to get back in. And we want to keep them in education to make sure that they're able to fulfill their potential, and eventually their community will benefit from that, their own lives will be better, and therefore the world will develop.
So talk a bit about Ireland. How would you describe the effect that the last global recession had on children in Ireland? But and I was going to say just in Ireland, but you can talk about the rest of the world if you want as well.
We know that there were many austerity measures taken in Ireland after the recession here, and they were necessary at the time. UNICEF would argue that the measures were disproportionately harsh for children, and the children are still bearing the brunt of those austerity measures. So while the country has now gone into recovery, and we're all very glad to hear that, we feel that there are still areas where children have not been brought back to par. Services need to be re-established, and there are many gaps in the system. We know, for example, there was a big report that we produced earlier in the summer called Report Card, which measures performance for Irish children against performance for children in other OECD countries. So these would be known as the wealthy nations. And again, while many of the children's rights are achieved in these countries, there are still many gaps. We know that in Ireland there is a huge problem with mental health. Looking at figures from 2014 and 2015, teen suicide was a major problem for children in that year. Now, we know that the figures have improved slightly since then, but clearly teenagers and young people in Ireland have very deep concerns that are very deeply felt. So we need to provide more for young people in terms of health services and specifically health services. And again, touching on what we mentioned earlier, housing and education are big priorities for us as well.
Are you calling on the Irish government to do anything in particular for children in the upcoming budget in a couple of weeks?
So Darren, we're touching on really many of those same issues again. So we know that we want to make sure that there are more health services on offer for children, and particularly looking in that area of mental health services. But also we know that lots of Irish children have nutritional concerns, and while that might be really surprising to some of your listeners, in actual fact nutrition is a big problem for many Irish children, and that's sometimes because they're not eating the right kind of food, or they're not being properly nourished in that sense. So we're more usually used to the idea of malnutrition in the situation where children do not have food to eat. But in Ireland that is not usually the problem, but it could be that people are not getting the right kind of education about food, or that it's very difficult for them to afford to eat easily and well. So, there are supports that could perhaps be offered in that area as well. Otherwise, again, housing, as mentioned, we need to make sure that the idea of a child being homeless in Ireland is completely unacceptable and unbelievable. We used to be at that point, but, we have arrived at a situation now where there are thousands of Irish children who are homeless, and we need to figure out a way of providing for them. It is a basic need, and they are entitled to have shelter. In addition to that, we listened with interest, and we very much welcomed An Taoiseach Varadkar's announcement of his intention at the Fine Gael Thinking in Clonmel that they do intend to increase overseas development aid. We're very happy to hear that, and we look forward to hearing the details of that in the budget.
Okay. It's true to say that you are working in some of the world's countries with the biggest problems, isn't it? I mean, countries in war or conflict. Could you name these countries and tell me a bit about how you are finding it to help the children in these countries? I'm thinking of Yemen and Syria, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, Darren. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about services for children and children's rights, but clearly we also work in the area of humanitarian situations, and that is in the event of crisis or emergency. Lots of people would be used to hearing about UNICEF in those kind of circumstances, and because we're in 190 countries around the world, we're always there, and we have always been there for a long time when an emergency breaks out, so we are well positioned to respond. Some of the countries that are currently in the middle of a crisis, as you mentioned, Yemen, and that is in many ways one of the world's worst crises that's happening at the moment. Specifically, there's a cholera crisis in Yemen at the moment, and that is the world's worst cholera crisis. There's about 5,000 people getting sick from cholera every day. It is something that is easily preventable if we were to provide better water and sanitation. And if health workers could be paid and if services were retained, we would be able to avoid the spread of preventable diseases like cholera, which is a deadly disease and is taking many lives and putting many children at risk in Yemen. There's also obviously a conflict going on in Yemen, and UNICEF would always call on all parties to conflict to allow access to children for humanitarian reasons, regardless of what side they are of the conflict. Then we do a lot of work in terms of development. So again, we're in 190 countries all over the world, and in every country children have different needs. So in another country, for example, it might be that children need better access to education, and so we look after that in those countries. Or for children, for example, who've managed to flee the crisis in Syria, they might need psychological help. So oftentimes they've managed to get to neighbouring countries like Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey. And we are present in those countries also, as well as in Syria itself. And in those areas, we would provide psychosocial support. So sometimes that's just offering family centres. Perhaps there are psychologists there on staff who can help families figure out how best to overcome some of the problems that children will manifest after going through the kind of traumas that they have gone through. So it might be that children need to have some behavioural help. They're obviously reacting to what they have gone through, and that might make them a little bit difficult in the home. So sometimes parents need support in terms of figuring out how to get back on an even keel and how to get things back to some kind of normality in the family life.
Yeah, we haven't got time to talk in depth about any other countries. You mentioned Yemen and Syria there. Do you want to just, because there's some countries I don't think you're able to get into, like North Korea. Are you able to get into North Korea, for example?
North Korea, off the top of my head, Darren, I would have to check for that. Yeah. I'm not sure.
But are there any other crisis countries that are in conflict? Like, I know there's a problem, I think it's northeast Nigeria and the Congo. Are you in these countries as well?
We are, absolutely, and you're completely right. There's a major crisis happening in northeast Nigeria. What's happening in that region is that there are several countries, and they're not connected geographically, or at least not in all cases connected geographically. We're calling it the Four Famines crisis. So really, since about this time last year, and largely as a result of conflict, children in Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, which we've already talked about, and Nigeria, as you mentioned, are in serious trouble in terms of malnutrition. And this is not always because there is no food available. Sometimes what's happened is because of conflict in their countries, or sometimes even just in pockets within a country, as you mentioned, northeast Nigeria, because of what's happening there with Boko Haram. What's happening is that, for example, in a family where they might traditionally have farmed, conflict will cause them to be displaced from their home place, so they have to move and they no longer have access to their livelihood, or their animals don't survive. Climate change is also a massive factor there. So if animals don't survive or if crops fail, then lack of food becomes a major issue for families, and it puts children in the position of effectively going towards a food crisis and eventually, unfortunately, famine.
You mentioned what you want from the Irish government both to do in Ireland, the issues to address in Ireland and internationally as regards our overseas development aid budget. If you have a message in summary to our listeners on Near FM about how we can keep up to date with what UNICEF are doing and maybe support you in Ireland or abroad, what would you recommend?
Well, what I would say to people is that there are so many interesting stories coming out of all the countries that we work in. And, if you are interested in hearing more about this, you can find us in a whole host of ways. So there's our website, which is www.unicef.ie. Or if you use Facebook, you can find us there, UNICEF Ireland. You can find us on Twitter, you can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn or YouTube. And in all of those places, you will find really interesting videos, you'll find interviews, you'll find first-hand stories from the field. You'll see opportunities to donate, and you can learn all kinds of things about the work that we do, which is incredibly broad-ranging and impossible to sum up in an interview.
I know you're doing huge work now with the global goals at the UN, and we haven't got time to talk about it today, but hopefully come back to you in a couple of weeks. We can talk about the world's largest lesson, the SDG. So thanks very much, Aedín. Right? Bye-bye.
Very welcome, Darren. Thanks very much for the time.